small room, breeding like insects in the corners of his mind where logic couldn't reach them. Had she been beautiful or plain? Had she loved someone who could not love her in return? Or had she died before love had the chance to find her? The contract had listed a considerable dowry, which suggested a family of some means. Why then had she died unmarried? In traditional families, marriages were arranged early, often in childhood. For a woman to reach 23 without a husband suggested either extraordinary circumstances or some flaw that made her unmarriageable. But what flaw could be so severe that a family would prefer to marry her to a stranger after death rather than accept a less than perfect match in life? Gian folded the contract carefully and placed it in his desk drawer beneath a stack of unpaid bills and rejection letters. The money he left on the table, where it caught the light and seemed to glow with its own inner fire. He would sleep on it, he decided. In the morning, with a clearer head and an empty stomach, he would decide what to do. But sleep proved as elusive as the work he had been seeking. Every time Gian closed his eyes, he found himself thinking about the girl, Lin Meihua, who had died at 23 with no husband to mourn her and no children to carry her memory. Gian turned onto his side, pulling his thin blanket closer against the cold. Outside, the night sounds of the hutong settled into their familiar rhythm. The distant hum of traffic from the main roads, the occasional footstep in the alley below, the whisper of wind through the narrow spaces between buildings. But underneath these ordinary sounds, so faint he might have imagined it, was something else. Weeping. It was soft and distant, the sound of someone crying alone in the darkness. Gian sat up in bed, pressing his ear to the thin wall that separated his room from Mrs. Wei's apartment. But the sound didn't seem to be coming from next door. It was fainter than that and more diffuse, as though it were rising from the very foundations of the building. He slipped from his bed and went to the window, pressing his face to the glass. The alley below was empty, lit by a single street lamp that cast long shadows between the buildings. The weeping continued, soft and rhythmic, like the sound of someone who had been crying for a very long time and had no hope of comfort. As he listened, Gian became aware of another sound beneath the tears, a man's voice, harsh and low, speaking in rapid, angry bursts. The words were too faint to understand, but the tone was unmistakable. The sound of someone delivering a furious lecture to a cowering audience. The voice rose and fell in the cadence of righteous anger, pausing occasionally as though waiting for responses that never came. The combination of weeping and anger made Gian's skin crawl. It sounded like the aftermath of violence, like someone being punished for crimes they might not have committed. He strained to locate the source of the sounds, but they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as though the building itself were remembering old tragedies. The voices continued for perhaps 20 minutes before fading away, leaving only the ordinary sounds of the night. But their echo lingered in John's mind, and when he finally slept, sometime near dawn, his dreams were filled with images of a young woman in white, standing in an empty room while a man's voice shouted accusations from the shadows. He woke to someone knocking at his door. The sound was soft but insistent, a polite rap, rap, rap that suggested people of good breeding and proper manners. John stumbled from his bed, still half caught in his dream, his mouth dry and his head thick with insufficient sleep. When he opened the door, he found 3 figures waiting in the hallway. An elderly man in a dark suit, flanked by a middle-aged woman, and a younger man who shared her delicate features. They stood with the formal bearing of people paying a condolence call, their faces arranged in expressions of solemn purpose. Their clothes, while not expensive, were well-maintained and formal, the kind of outfits reserved for important occasions and family obligations. The woman held a small bouquet of white flowers that filled the narrow hallway with their bitter perfume. "Mr. Joe John?" the elderly man asked. Though John had never given his full name to anyone in the building, his voice was cultured and careful, with the measured tones of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We are the Lin family. We have come to discuss your marriage to our daughter." The words hit Jian like cold water, washing away the last vestiges of sleep and leaving him acutely aware of his surroundings. The musty smell of the hallway and the sound of Mrs. Wei's television bleeding through thin walls, the way the three strangers looked at him with expressions that suggested they had every right to be there. In the morning light, the previous night's decision seemed like the product of hunger-induced delirium. He had not seriously intended to go through with such an arrangement. "I think there's been a mistake," Jian began. But the elderly man, who could only be Lin Weidong, the father named in the contract, raised a hand to silence him. "There is no mistake," he said gently. "You accepted our daughter's dowry. By taking the envelope into your home, you agreed to the terms of the contract. We have come to welcome you to our family and to explain what is expected of you." The woman stepped forward, and Jian saw that her eyes were red with weeping, though her face remained composed. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a simple bun, and hands that showed the calluses of someone who had worked hard all her life. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years of accumulated sorrow. "Our Meiwa has been alone too long," she said, extending the bouquet toward him. 3 years she has waited for a husband. 3 years without the comfort of family or the hope of children. You will be good to her, won't you? You will treat her with kindness and respect. The flowers in her hands were chrysanthemums, their white petals perfect, and their scent overwhelming in the confined space of the hallway. Jian found himself taking them before he could think to refuse, and the moment his fingers touched the stems, he felt a strange shock of recognition, as though he had held these exact flowers before in some half-remembered dream. "This is insane," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can't seriously believe." "What we believe is irrelevant," Lin Weidong interrupted, his tone still gentle, but carrying an undertone that suggested contradiction would be unwise. "The contract has been signed by your acceptance of the dowry. The ceremony was completed the moment you brought the envelope into your home. You are married now in the eyes of our ancestors and the spirits that watch over family obligations." Jian wanted to slam the door, wanted to shout that they were all mad, that ghost marriages were superstition and nothing more. Instead, he found himself stepping aside to let them enter, his body moving without conscious direction. They filed into his small room with the dignified bearing of visiting royalty, arranging themselves on his furniture as though they had every right to be there. The younger man, the brother, Jian assumed, placed a small suitcase on the table beside the money that still lay where Jian had left it. "Meiwa's things," he explained simply. "Clothes, jewelry, photographs. She will want them close." The mother began to weep again, soft tears that she wiped away with a handkerchief embroidered with tiny flowers. "She was such a good girl," she whispered. "So obedient, so dutiful. She never gave us a moment's trouble until..." She trailed off, her words hanging in the air like an unfinished prayer. Lin Weidong shot her a sharp look, and she fell silent, pressing the handkerchief to her eyes. "Until what?" Jian asked, his curiosity overcoming his fear. The family exchanged glances, some communication passing between them that Jian couldn't interpret. The silence stretched uncomfortably before the father finally spoke. "Until she met a young man who filled her head with romantic nonsense," he said, his voice taking on an edge of old anger. a boy with no prospects and no respect for family traditions. He convinced her